Today's August 7, 2023, and I'm honored today to have Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. Jay, tell us your efforts, your interests.
So it's so good to talk with you, Randy, again. So I'm a professor in the School of Medicine at Stanford. I'm a professor of health policy now. I was a long-time school professor of medicine. I have been pretty active during the pandemic. Of course, you've been kind enough to have me on your podcast a few times. Probably most prominently, I wrote the Great Barrington Declaration in October 2020 with Sunetra Gupta of Oxford and Martin Kulldorff of Harvard, where we argued for a very different approach to this pandemic involving focused protection of vulnerable people and lifting of lockdowns that I really, really wish we'd followed. Unfortunately, most places didn't.
That was an amazing thing. I was looking over your article from March 2020 in the Wall Street Journal. I can't quite remember the title, but I think you point out, I mean, in a sense, it's a category error. They were announcing levels of death, mortality, at least an order of magnitude too high. Is that true?
Yeah, it is true. So the World Health Organization in March 2020 put out estimates, essentially a case fatality rate, saying it's 3.4% or somewhere 3 and 4% mortality of case fatality rate. The problem with the case fatality rate is that the denominator is all the really severe cases that show up and come to the attention of people early in the pandemic, and 3 or 4% of them died, right? But that doesn't mean that if you get infected that you have a 3 or 4% chance of dying. And in fact, the infection fatality rate, that is the probability of dying conditional on infection, turned out to be an order of magnitude lower than that, maybe 0.2, 0.3%, based on a whole bunch of, we can talk about that, about how I know this, but like basically a whole bunch of studies of population-wide studies of antibodies in the population, trying to get a better estimate of that denominator. And it turns out that by April, or by as early as April 2020, there were 40 or 50 infections per case. That the disease was like three in Santa Clara County, California. I did a study here, and then in LA County, another study I did in early April found that 3 or 4% of the population already had COVID and recovered, and so the mortality rate was 0.2 to 0.3% rather than 3 or 4%, and that the disease was the horse was out of the barn. We weren't going to like suppress it to zero. That was already far too late for that.
Yeah, I think I told you one of the episodes. I told you about my dream that it was vivid. I tried to train ice not to melt. It was a hot day. It seems similarly Sisyphean, if we can use that as an adjective, without losing too much of our audience. The efforts that we did to kind of box in this thing that's not really boxable.
Yeah, I mean, like you just basically the rock keeps sliding back down the hill every time you push it up, right? I mean, that's, and like we would, like I remember Governor Cuomo declaring victory over COVID, right? In fact, I think he got an Emmy for this because it was insane. It's like like this. It's as if it's as if he's King Canute. Who King Canute says like don't. Well, I'm going to stop. He goes out and tries to stop the tides in order to show his admirers that he doesn't have the power to do so. It's like the opposite of King Canute. Like you have Andrew Cuomo going around saying he conquered COVID, crushed the curve, right, through their draconian efforts. And of course, COVID comes back because the rock is always going to slip back down the hill because this is a highly infectious respiratory virus, and we have no technology to stop it.
Yeah, no, I wrote an article recently in Brownstone called "The Marvelous Mr. McNeil." I don't know if you're familiar with the erstwhile chief science writer, global health expert at the New York Times. He's actually he was out in California. He got his degree out in Berkeley in rhetoric, and I think he's a skilled writer, very bright guy, but he's not a scientist, and I'm not sure he necessarily knows how to really parse science, although he's reported on it for decades. No longer, because the New York Times got even woker than he. That's a totally separate story. But part of my research, which was extensive on his articles, talked about his February 2020 article, "The Coronavirus Go Medieval" on it. He also, I was in for my 1 millionth high school reunion recently in New York City. I am that old, and a lot of the guys I spoke to were aware, frankly, more not of his articles, but of his podcast. They apparently in New York City, New York Times podcasts are a big deal. And he was kind of like, haranguing people worse than the alien invasion of Orson Welles that that this was going to wipe everybody out. So even before COVID had landed, he wanted to go medieval on it. So, one of his articles, August, reveals kind of, behind the green curtain what he was up to. And he, is very proud to boast that he was on a special call before writing the medieval article in February 2020 and January and so forth. He had been on a series of calls with the top 8 public health experts. And he let out that one of them was Dr. Fauci. And we'll just have to guess who the other ones might have been. And they were ones who were pushing this kind of bioweapon level calamity on us, coincident with the time that the Diamond Princess was circulating in Yokohama Harbor and whatnot without people dropping dead. So you wrote your article on the heels of that. How informed were you on the go medieval on it? Did you want to go medieval on it? What does that even mean?
So I do remember the Go Medieval on It article, although I didn't read it at the time. It's only an ex post that I saw it. Mm-hmm. I do remember seeing O'Neill on a show with David Katz on CNN. I think it was like April 2020, where Katz very reasonably argued for focused protection of vulnerable people, older people primarily, because that's who was at risk from the virus. And Katz very reasonably said that these kinds of measures are going to harm, like closing schools, are going to cause a lot of harm. And O'Neill excoriated Katz in the most vile terms on CNN. I mean, he just went after him in a way that it was absolutely disgusting to watch, and utterly irresponsible on the part of O'Neill. And I think broadly speaking, this is exactly how a lot of people in the media and in public health behaved. They decided that anyone who disagreed with their draconian policies was a threat to the public at large and worthy of contempt and destruction. Even though David Katz was a Yale professor, a very prominent sort of and distinguished career in health and certainly capable of evaluating these the data on his own. In the early days of the pandemic, I was thinking about the H1N1, the swine flu pandemic in 2009, and this distinction between this infection fatality rate and this case fatality rate. The same thing happened in 2009. And I guess very naively thought that if we had seroprevalence studies telling us how widespread the disease was, that we wouldn't go down this crazy path. Mm-hmm. And what I didn't know was that the public health establishment, led by people like Tony Fauci, had decided that this was the only thing we could do, that the lockdowns were. I have a theory, by the way, Randy. If you could indulge me on my theory. So
absolutely. That's what we're here for.
Okay, so let's accept as a premise of my theory, and we can argue this if you want, but I don't want to argue these points. I just want to accept as a premise, and those who don't agree with the premise. So stipulate A, that this virus was the result of a gain of function experiments designed to prevent a pandemic from happening. Mm-hmm. All right. Where you go into the bat caves of China, bring those viruses, put them into labs in large, prominent population centers, and then in low security labs where you do dangerous research on them. Let's stipulate that happened. Mm-hmm. I think that's pretty much undeniable that we did that. B, that the pandemic was caused by a leak, or at least potentially. Actually, let's stipulate something easier than that, so that everyone can agree with us. That many prominent scientific bureaucrats responsible for funding of this research thought it may have been caused by this leak. Okay, that we can stipulate. Mm-hmm. And that this was known by late December, early January 2020. Let's stipulate all of these.
2019.
I'm sorry, 2019. Late December 2019, early January 2020. Right. Let's stipulate all of these things. Now you have the Chinese government going medieval on it, right? Locking down their vast population centers in January 2020. You have the World Health Organization sending a delegation to China to evaluate how successful they had been, and they come back triumphantly. It's like triumphantly saying mission accomplished, that they had actually successfully suppressed the virus by this draconian effort of locking down society. locking people into buildings, killing their pets, making sure violating their civil rights en masse. Okay, so you have all that. The World Health Organization saying this, and Tony Fauci is feeling increasingly guilty that maybe people might blame him and the NIH for opening Pandora's box. Right? So this is what I'm calling Pandora's box theory, right? So what would you do in that situation? Right? You would deploy your media resources to try to convince the population to go medieval on it because you think the Chinese medieval strategy worked. You would scare the living daylights because if you don't, the disease is going to go spread everywhere, and you're going to get potentially blamed for opening Pandora's box and being the cause of this by supporting this research that led to the leak of the virus.
Mm. Yeah, that's the CYA theory, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think there's an element of that. I mean, haven't the good doctor's emails somewhat exemplified that, or no?
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, you're not going to find, he's too smart to like have a smoking gun email saying, I need to get rid of this virus because people might blame me. I mean, he's not going to say that directly in his emails, but you can piece together every other piece of it, right? So you can piece together the interactions he has with Cliff Lane, his deputy, who goes on this World Health Organization junket, where they're talking about how the Chinese strategy worked in February 2020. The lockdown strategy of Wuhan. You can piece together the cover-up of the idea of a lab leak organized by Tony Fauci and Francis Collins and Jeremy Farrar and some others. That's all in FOIA documents. That's all well documented. You can go back and see the discussions about whether this kind of research is dangerous from the debate in 2014 over the pause of gain-of-function research and their role they played in that, which was actually a prominent role in making sure that the research actually did end up happening. We did get supported by the American taxpayers. So all of these pieces, and you can also finally you can see the role that they played in recommending lockdowns to the United States president, President Trump, essentially trying to make sure that Trump never got exposed to alternate views by the war that they waged against Scott Atlas when Trump picked Scott Atlas to be one of his advisors, right? And the way that they treated me and Sunetra Gupta and Martin Kulldorff when we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration for daring to sort of contradict them, or the way David Katz got treated by someone like Don O'Neill, right? These people, they were they acted in ways that are so far outside the bounds it's almost unimaginable to me as someone who's been in scientific circles for decades. I realized literally I couldn't imagine that people would behave this way, and yet they did. You can look at documented evidence that they behaved this, and the question is why. And I think this Pandora's box theory is as good as any. Like they really thought that they needed to do this in order to protect the public.
I think there were a few elements. I have kind of an additional layer on your theory, perhaps, but just to address it, yours. I think the whole concept wherein we were kind of outsourcing or insourcing our gain of function research to China is a craziness, is an absurdity. Either you like this kind of research or you don't. I mean, I bring this up, it's totally separate topic, and maybe we'll touch on it later. But right now, I think still continuing in Baltimore at Bloomberg School of Public Health, Dr. Anna Durbin from Johns Hopkins is injecting and infecting women with the Zika virus. That's my thing, and brings up two separate questions. I mean, if Zika is dangerous, why would you be injecting women with it? If it's not dangerous, why are you injecting women with it? It's kind of like in either side, they're doing something for their own benefit because they can generate money and interest and all that kind of stuff. And so I think the gain of function had some curiosity, but it also is part of this kind of revenue thing. Government differs from industry. In industry, you want to save money because you might need the money later on, and it's not replenishable necessarily. So you're frugal with your expenses. But in government, if you don't spend your amount, then they say next year, oh, you didn't spend it, you need less, you'll get less. So there's kind of this eternal, clamoring and crying and whining for more money. And I think part of it, again, getting back to my pet, Zika, part of the thing is, if you create this new kind of like boogeyman, then you have more funding coming. And Zika is only $1 billion. And these other things, it's part of the industry model to aggrandize things. And so they were able to they wanted to do the studies, and they were offloading money to China. How reliable is China? So I think part of the, say, original sin here is entrusting your research in PRC China, CCP China. And I think that is kind of an admission against interest for Fauci to have. And I think, there's probably some element of cover up, and as that goes along with this. So I think it's very, possible, and that they were just, they were embarrassed or humiliated, or potentially might be, for having endangered and engendered research in China to begin with, and having trusted them. So rather than point their fingers like, oh my God, that's terrible, because they're complicit, they have to kind of cover it up.
And it's still ongoing. This is not just in the past, right? So the NIH funded the EcoHealth Alliance which conducted this research in China in collaboration with the Wuhan lab, up until just very recently, I think.
I know that.
And the whole pandemic preparedness industry, which was aimed at preventing the pandemics from happening by predicting them early, and then B, in preparing so that we can address them. The funding for that has exploded, right? So it's not like that's gone and in the past. Like they absolutely have doubled down on this failure. And the whole World Health Organization treaty revisions that are coming up. I think people will start debating about them in 2024 when finally negotiated. They're pointing in the direction of increasing the power of international agencies and of governments to lock down societies at scale with much less resistance the next time there's a pandemic, right? So the direction of reform it's not just like to hide that they failed last time, but to double down on the same strategies that led to that failure.
Now, that's a frightening thing. Maybe you can just kind of get us up to speed in where that is. Like how gullible are governments in allowing, kind of these nose under the tent, foot in the door, Trojan horse, whatever other example, metaphor, to kind of let their own governmental needs, their own populist needs, be subservient to that of this amorphous, nice sounding World Health Organization or the United Nations, kind of banal sounding organizations. But once you sacrifice your agency, I don't think you get it back.
Well, I think the promise is, like, if you're a government and you're like saying, okay, how do I make myself popular? Well, maybe I can protect people against these risks that are coming. And you have scientists, and you laid it out very, very well, Randy. Like, you have scientists that come and tell you, well, you just fund us to do this work, and we will give you a way to tell the population that we're protecting against the next pandemic. We'll have vaccines available within weeks of the discovery of this, because we'll have already studied the virus before it even starts to make an emergence. It's really difficult for a politician to say no to something like that, because they're like, what are you going to do? Like the scientists or the bureaucrat can go to the public and say, look, these politicians are anti-science, right, they're endangering you.
Yeah, no, I also think this is kind of we've seen it happen in the bureaucratization of our governmental apparatus. I'm not sure what people do on Capitol Hill with the elected officials. I mean, it seems like they run hearings now and then, but a lot of what they are, the sausage factory they're operating or looking over, just seems to work on its own. And a lot of these things, I'm sure you're familiar with the Chevron decision. And whatnot. A lot of the bureaucracy just seems to be on autopilot, and it gets fed. It's like one big furnace, and you have to feed it money. And I guess there's a whole separate bureaucratic apparatus for collecting the money. And Congress, they don't seem to have much control over the bureaucratic state. And a lot of these bureaucracies, and again, in this case, the CDC, NIH, NIAID, they seem to have their own bulwark. They're not really afraid of the our
Well,
our representatives and our elected officials.
I mean, I don't know if you ever like had the privilege of looking back at some of the appearances of people like Tony Fauci and Francis Collins before Congress, before the pandemic. I mean, it's disgusting. It's just this mutual admiration fest where the Congress people that are supposed to be overseeing them are just like gushing with praise over all the vast leadership of the tens of billions of dollars that they're spending. Francis Collins is like, or Tony Fauci are just like praising to no end these Congress people who are like so pro science that they would wisely fund this, and enable this research. I think what happens with these federal bureaucracies is, you have people like Tony Fauci, they've been there for 40 years almost, right? Or Francis Collins, like a decade of leadership at the head of the National Institute of Health. They capture these institutions, they mold them into their image, and the power is almost unimaginable, right? So you can't get tenure at a top medical university unless you have funding from the NIH. If you don't, so you control the social status and the ability of scientists to do work. And now during the pandemic, these same people who control the minds and futures of a tremendous number of biomedical scientists turn around and say, you better lockdowns only roll away. And if you cross me, we're going to call you fringe. No, there's no lab leak. Don't be ridiculous. It's to say otherwise is a conspiracy theory. So even if you're a prominent scientist saying otherwise, you're a conspiracist. Essentially, they abuse their position atop the biomedical hierarchy in this federal bureaucracy to silence countless other scientists. They made examples of people who crossed them so that other scientists would not cross them.
Yeah.
And these federal bureaucracies are just basically there's just unchecked power. As you said, Congress didn't do anything. In fact, and courts during the pandemic, I was an expert witness for a whole bunch of like anti-lockdown cases, anti-mandate cases, all pro bono, because I was so incensed over these policies. And what I found was that courts were scared they just would take the CDC's word as given. You can't, if the CDC says it must be true, why would they say something not true, right? And so if you did something the CDC was give guidance on, well, it had the force of law because the courts would enforce it as if it were law, even though it wasn't. So there was no check or balance to this. You just had unchecked power at a vast level and a population that was so scared by the pronouncements of these very agencies that they also enforced locally the kinds of like like the go mask toddlers and yell at moms that aren't masking toddlers.
Yeah, I mean, I just saw a tweet back from a couple years ago. I think Australia, a policeman choking a woman on the street. I guess because she wasn't handling the respiratory emergency well enough, so they were going to kind of give her a respiratory emergency on top of it.
Well, it's the violation of civil rights on a mass scale. I've never seen before in my lifetime. Now, you could go back in American history and talk about the violation of civil rights of blacks. You could go back in our democracies have seen mass violation of civil rights before, but in modern history, the violation of civil rights, including the most basic rights of our democracies, like free speech, being violated at scale, I don't think I've seen. At least, certainly, I've never noticed at scale in my lifetime. With basically no check or balance for the last three and a half years until just recently.
Yeah. Moreover, it was a lockstep lockdown. And I like to point out for my listeners, I have these skilled fingers. I know how to Google stuff. And, so I go and I put the pre-2018 lens on filter, and lockdown, public health, has never occurred. I mean, there are two incidences. One is in Gabon, one is in South Africa, and one's in prison. The other one's like a severe tuberculosis colony. Maybe like, I don't know. and they had lockdowns for whatever reason, but they've never been committed upon a general population, and never ever as in terms of public health. I mean, maybe somebody did that in when people actually did go medieval on illnesses in the medieval era. One of the examples I brought up in my article on Donald McNeil is like, what is it to mean to go medieval on a virus? And the Black Death was not a virus, but a bacterium. When people went medieval on that is not always a great thing. At one point, they decided that the Jews of, I think, Mainz, Germany, and other places were the vector, as opposed to the rats, which they had not figured out. But later on, I guess Hitler conflated the two of them, rats and Jews. Anyway, totally separate story. But they would put all the Jews into the synagogue, lock the doors, burn it. And, so that was a form of ablation practiced upon the virus by public health measures to go medieval on something. So, I think you be careful what you wish for, because you might get it. And of course we did. And so this concept of going medieval is so backward thinking. I mean, what does that even mean? Anyway, I don't want to harp on that thing because that's my particular area of interest, but it seems as if we did go medieval on it, and we went medieval in the sense that we got superstitious. What's the word when you just kind of like yell at and imprison your enemies? Despotic.
Well, I mean, I think that just to pick up where you're going, I think the key difference is that we made lockdowns and biomedical security as the central organizing principle of our domestic policy and our government action. That, I think, has never been done at scale for such an extended period of time. Like the normal way we dealt with respiratory virus pandemics in the past, and you don't have to go back that far in history, like in 2009 with swine flu. If you go back to like the way we deal with the like pandemic flu in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on, is focused protection. You identify vulnerable people, use whatever technologies you have to protect them, and don't panic society, don't disrupt society, because the disruption will cause more harm than good, not just to the people who's that are low risk, but even potentially to the high risk people, because the panic itself induces problems.
Absolutely.
So you that was the old wisdom, and that's the wisdom that we threw out in favor of these crazy lockdowns. And now we're paying the price. Like, well, I mean, we were paying the price all along, but like the price is becoming clear. You're seeing children years behind or in their schooling with this very deeply unequal thing, where it's like minority kids and poor kids that are the furthest behind because they were locked down the most. They had the least capacity to replace their education. Like in places like Uganda, 4.5 million kids out of school for 2 years never come back to school. A generational inequality caused by the lockdowns.
Yeah.
And they didn't have schools. They had zero school, not even Zoom school, which is just a complete waste. 100 million people were thrown into poverty, according to the UN. So the World Bank estimates in summer of 2020, that was the estimate of how many people would be thrown into dire poverty, $2 a day or less of income worldwide. I don't know if it's exact number, but it's something on that scale have been thrown into poverty as a consequence of the economic dislocation caused by the lockdowns in the poorest countries of the world. And the economic damage from the lockdowns in rich countries continues, right? So like the high interest rates we currently face, the inflation we've been facing, the struggle over the sluggish growth, all of that is attributable to the vast amounts of money we spent in order to enable the lockdowns to happen in the first place. Yeah. And as I said, it's the poor, the vulnerable, the working class people that have suffered the most. I call the lockdown policy a trickle-down epidemiology policy. The theory is that we can, if we lock down and make so that the lives of the poor are the worst, like you essentially, like if you're essential, you get to stay home. If you're essential, you have to go out and work. You face the cost, you face the risk. Everyone else, the rich, non-essential people will get to stay home, stay safe. And somehow the lockdowns then are, well, we just make the lives of the poor working class people worse by locking them down, and that will, by osmosis, protect everybody, right? That's trickle-down epidemiology. So I think it was just an immoral policy, and you could say it obviously didn't work. COVID spread everywhere anyways. Like you look at Sweden, and their all-cause excess deaths from not locking down are lower than almost all, it affected all the rest of Europe all through the pandemic. California and Florida, the all-cause excess deaths are higher in California through the pandemic than Florida. That's just a fact, a very inconvenient one, but it is a fact, right? So what did we buy with the lockdowns? We didn't protect human life. In fact, we cost human life with it. Going medieval on it was a huge, huge mistake.
The costs and repercussions. I don't know how much you've covered the rest of the world. We tend to look myopically, presbyopically, or some wrong way at kind of the industrial world. Europe, U.S. Swaths of Africa did not seem to have much in the way of coronavirus complaints or problems or issues or excess mortality, and frankly, they have the opposite. I have a book in galleys on cancer, and we just won yet another book on cancer, but I kind of look upon it as I looked at actually this phrase up. It's kind of unseemly, it sounds at first, but basically I've always thought of cancer as a disease of success. In the sense that societies, ancient societies where people didn't live long enough, they didn't have cancer. So if you look back, the Egyptians, whatever, it's a reasonable society for the time, but the median age of death was, between 29 and 35. Maybe the pharaohs lived a little bit longer. But they didn't have cancer much. And a lot of these old societies don't record it. And in the similar way, there's not that much cancer problem in Africa. And ditto, I'm getting to the point here. Ditto, there wasn't that much in the way of COVID problems because the population skews younger. There's almost, like a 1 sigma differential in life expectancy between most of sub-Saharan Africa, excluding, the country of South Africa, versus, Japan, North Asia, and Europe, and so forth, the U.S. So what happened there? I don't know if you want to speak on that, but again, I think that the real issue they had was the one you are speaking of, is this kind of economic loss, this build kind of falling off a cliff, and their prospects falling off a cliff, potentially generationally.
The economic thing, there's just no question, Randy, that was the primary problem. Like we broke supply chains. Well, the pointy end of those supply chains is some guy who's like loses his job that he used to barely feed his family, and with many kids, and now he earns less than $2 a day, and they starve. That is what a supply chain disruption actually means for the poor of the world, right? And so you have that, and then you overlay that with misplaced priorities on health, right? So Gavi, this organization that funds vaccines in the poor parts of the world, they redirected their resources away from vaccinating kids against measles, an actually deadly disease with a very effective vaccine, in favor of anti-COVID efforts in places like Africa. And as you said, there's a very low fraction of the population in Africa. I think it's like 3% of the population that's over the age of 65. The median age is in the teens. For the African continent. And so the risk of dying from COVID is very low for the vast majority of the African population because they're young. At the same time, the risk of measles harming the lives or killing young people in Africa is actually quite high. I mean, the measles outbreak is for little kids is quite deadly, potentially, especially for unvaccinated kids. And so imagine redirecting resources in Africa away from something that you know for certain will protect kids from a dangerous infectious disease to something where it's very, very low risk to these kids. And for what? You don't even have this. In 2020 they did this. They didn't even have a vaccine. And even in 2021, when they did have a vaccine, it wasn't available at scale in Africa. most people didn't use it or need it because COVID spread everywhere in Africa, not killing that many people, in part because they're so young.
I think we'll also find out that the vaccines that got shipped were not kept at adequate temperatures. They were probably
useless
placebo vaccines. I listened to your talk with Rav Avora and Dr. Malone recently. Can you just maybe tell us some of your insights from that talk? Maybe part 2 is not out yet. I don't know what, you don't want to necessarily scoop it, but what are your thoughts from having that conversation with Dr. Malone?
Well, I mean, he's a really interesting guy and really interesting man. I think he had a background that I didn't have in both first in the mRNA vaccine and also his connections with some folks in the defense industry and their relations to like public health. I mean, I think that there's a whole side of this story that needs to be explored, right? So we've talked about the lab leak, and I've come at it from the civilian side because that's what data I have access to.
Mm-hmm.
But why did we support this kind of gain of function research? Well, it has this dual use aspect, right? It potentially is a bioweapons research as well as pandemic prevention research. It has this the vaccination efforts could potentially have this like national security implications because you can use it to vaccinate troops before your enemy does or whatever. That part of the story is really not. I don't know that part of the story, and he hints at that in our conversation that are in ways that I think quite interesting, like the role of the security infrastructure and the role that security infrastructure played in public health thinking early in the pandemic, I think is quite important. And so the question is, what do we do about that? Like, how do we get information about that? I think it's going to take a long time for that kind of information to fully come out. But he's telling partly that story, so it's really fascinating to talk with him. Seems like a very brave man.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to speak with him except once in Panda. He was on the show. I was a little bit quizzical about why he vaccinated. I mean, I think he vaccinated after he had the illness. I find that an oddity. That could segue into another question about whether, we've spoken about this a little bit before, but what's the deal with vaccinating after an illness? And may I indulge in my Dr. Fauci quote?
It's your podcast, Randy. You get to do what you like.
All right. Well, people say I have a spot on Fauci, so I'm going to do it because it's fun and I can. But in 2005, he's recorded on C-SPAN being asked.
By the way, Randy, if you ever get Sunetra Gupta on your podcast, ask her to do her Fauci invitation. It's fantastic.
Oh, good. We could have a Fauci off. So he was asked, should one get the flu shot? I'm not sure which flu it was that year. If one has already had that influenza. So he's like, no, this would be crazy. You would never want to get the vaccine after you've had the illness. The illness itself is the full immunity. Why would you want to get a single antigen for that vaccine, for that virus? Anyway, so you get the idea. So he says this, that you should never, do this thing that all of a sudden we have to do over and over and over again. And just as a side, as an anecdote, it's not data full per se, but I was speaking with a physician friend of mine, and unfortunately his sister passed this mortal coil, and she had some other mental health issues and whatnot, but he's looking over her records, and he's a very brilliant guy and thorough, and he found that she had just gotten, before she had a coagulopathy that caused her death, she had her seventh, I'm going to use my prop here, she had her seventh, I can't see all the numbers at once, such a big number, her seventh vaccine. And what is the deal there? I mean, when did vaccines, as a contra to Dr. Fauci's sane 2005 advice, when did they become this kind of therapeutic mode as opposed to preventive?
Well, I think I mean, like, you can think of like examples like rabies or something. You're supposed to get the vaccine after you get exposed or whatever. And maybe it's been a long time since you got tetanus shot, and you step on a rusty nail and you go, okay, I'm going to go re-up. Okay, that's fine. That's one thing. So it's not. I don't think it's unprecedented. But I will say this: like for this vaccine, I don't think that the public health authorities expected it to wane in effectiveness as much as it did,
Right.
especially against transmission. Right? There was that big randomized trial in December 2020, but they followed the people for like 2 months, and they're like, 95% effective against symptomatic infection for 2 months. And when the evidence started coming out that it was waning in effectiveness, and that was like late spring 2021. Late spring, or certainly summer 2021, from Israel, from Qatar, from all over the place. It sent them into a tailspin because all of their hopes were like, okay, this vaccine is going to get rid of this disease. We just need to force everyone to get vaccinated, and the disease will go away. Pandora's box will be closed. Right. And so, like a reasonable person then would say, well, look, okay, is it doing something? I mean, I think you can make an argument, and I believe it. I believe the argument is true that especially for vulnerable people who are vulnerable to a severe reaction to the virus that had never had the virus before, the vaccine reduces the risk of death by an amount that it makes it worthwhile to get the vaccine.
But in a preload.
Yeah. Now, I mean, that's an argument. Now, of course, there's still potential side effects and so on that we don't know about. Let's put ourselves in the footsteps of 2021 or something. And there's a lot of uncertainty about the side effects, but we know that it reduces the risk of death in older people, right? Then you say reasonably, let's take that risk. And for younger people, the reduction in the risk of death, the absolute risk of death is very small because the absolute risk of death is very small in young people. Right. So the calculus is different in young people. That's, I think, a reasonable read of how to think about the vaccine then. But what they did, like people in public health, people like Tony Fauci did, is they said, well, my gosh, the vaccine is declining in efficacy. Let's double against disease spread. Let's double down.
Which seems to be kind of a modus operandi.
Yeah, I mean, and instead of now in 2020, they're running this large scale randomized trial with something at least as a meaningful outcome, right? You care about prevention of symptomatic infection. I would rather know about prevention of transmission, which would have shown a failure, or prevention of severe disease. That would have been more informative. But at least something you care about: prevention of symptomatic infection. The booster studies don't even look at that. The outcome they look at is antibody production. Well, I mean, like, okay, yeah, so we can get your antibodies, we can juice your antibodies up for a month or two. And then what? Do I care about my antibody production? It's a secondary outcome of a biomarker that doesn't really, I don't really, if I'm a patient, care about. What I care about is, will I die if I get this disease? And there's no indication that this vaccine or anything else we've done or have done protects you against getting the disease, short of becoming, Howard Hughes, a hermit, and holding yourself up in some mansion, and protecting and making sure no human being comes anywhere near you, right? Short of that, we have no capacity of no technology to stop you from getting the disease. You can lie to yourself about masks, but the evidence both from the randomized studies and from sort of real world experience is that the masks don't actually stop you from getting infected.
Yeah. I think it was the Dan mask study. You're familiar with that?
Yeah.
That was late 2020, November 2020 or something like that. And they found that, if there was a difference, it was minuscule, not worth all the effort, not worth all the.
Yeah, there are two arms. So it was 1.8% of the masked arm and 2.1% of the unmasked arm got COVID. No, there's no statistically significant difference between the two groups. It's just if you look back before the pandemic, there were a dozen randomized studies using for the flu and masks, including like studies where they randomized people going on the Muslim Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, but they randomized tents. One tent gets the mask, one tent doesn't. There wasn't a ton of, it was like, I don't know, some 50% compliance or something, because it's hard to get people to mask, right? Especially in the desert heat. But both tents have the flu at the same rate. Both sets of tents have flu at the same rate. You have, I mean, and there's like a dozen other studies of varying quality, but some better than others. But like, there's no evidence at all that definitively shows that masks work. And yet that's what we said. Like, you have people coming out and say, like prominent people saying, oh, 80% of it's better, masks are better than vaccines. The most anti-vax statement I've seen during the pandemic are people going around saying that nonsense. And so prominent people in public health are saying this nonsense. So we have no technology for stopping the spread of this disease, and yet we're lying to people. So of course there are going to be people that respond to that by saying, well, if my antibodies go down, I'll just keep taking the booster 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. And what are the side effects? Well, we have no idea. How no one studied it.
Yeah,
of what happens when you take it 7
it's not
times.
just that vaccine per se, it's the modality. Again, I think you spoke on this topic as well, is like, why choose this? I mean, I could see if some geographic area, wanted to get a special reward and try the mRNA modality, but we already had, basic, I don't know how you categorize the adenovirus carrier type for the flu shot that I think Johnson & Johnson used, and other,
that's not a traditional vaccine for the flu. The flu vaccine is a very different kind of vaccine. That one is actually so they used adenovirus, and they attached essentially the antigens for the spike protein to the adenovirus, which then introduced this antigen into the cells. So it's a different kind of mechanism than the traditional vaccine. But the advantage of those adenovirus vaccines is that they actually, in the randomized trials, actually found reductions in all-cause death compared to placebo in the randomized trials. A statistically significant difference in so like there's this fantastic epidemiologist in Denmark named Christine Stable-Ben who reanalyzed the data and found this. Right, whereas like the randomized trials of the mRNAs, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, there was no statistically significant reduction in all-cause mortality in the trials. In fact, there was actually, also statistically insignificant, but actually higher mortality in the vaccine arm than in the placebo arm in those trials. So if you were just going off the trials, you would have said, well, why don't we adopt these adenovirus vaccines? That would be a better bet. Like, again, putting yourself in the shoes of December 2020, when really the most information we had was the trials. The trials indicated an all-cause mortality benefit for the adenovirus vaccines, but not for the other vaccines, for the mRNAs.
Well, I think there was, a silliness or craziness, and I think I don't want to have put on my conspiracy hat too much, but I think this was a conduit. I think mRNA treatments may very well prove to be wonderful for particular problems. Kind of personalized.
At this point, I think you'll have a lot of trouble getting people to uptake it.
Well, maybe when they have some pancreatic cancer, or whatever.
Yeah. But even that, for a decade, they tried to use it for cancer, and failed. Right? They hadn't the mRNAs had failed as a technology to introduce any therapeutic benefit.
Yeah, but I think it was kind of a way of I think they wanted to get Teflon out of NASA. I think they wanted to have this technological boost. Surfing this wave of we're having a pandemic. Why don't we just try this? Maybe this will give some industry boost later on. Now, a lot of the same arguments you hear about greening of America. There are going to be so many more jobs because we've gotten rid of so many industries, whatever. Like all the kind of clouds inside the silver linings inside the clouds. Anyway, I just don't understand that. I don't know. Do you have any insight about why that was chosen?
I mean, it is definitely a mystery. Like I think that I think you're right that there must have played some part in the thinking around this, right? Because why not just go with a traditional vaccine technology? Or I think if I'm putting myself in the shoes of Pfizer or Moderna, you have these scientists that are telling you this finally is ready for prime time. It's worth the bet. And if it works, now you have a platform for the delivery, not just of this antigen, but any antigen you want. It's like software,
Yeah,
right?
so that brings up. I'm going to cut you. I'm going to interject. I apologize, interrupting. But that kind of brings up a second question. If that's the case, why did they persist with the ancestral vaccine when the VOCs, the variants of concern, proceeded through the Greek alphabet to a point, obviously skipping over XI in deference to the, our world leader.
China, yeah.
But I apologize for boring you, but the analogy I came up with is Alec Baldwin, and he's got 3 brothers, and they're all actors, and they're all less famous. But let's stipulate Alec Baldwin is the dangerous Baldwin. He punches photographers, he shoots actors, whatever. He shoots film people, so forth. So he's the dangerous Baldwin. He's the Baldwin to watch out for. So you immunize your security by giving everyone pictures of Alec Baldwin. So they're really good at preventing Alec Baldwin. He's the ancestral SARS-CoV-2. Now, all of a sudden, people come to your party, I don't know, your Hugh Hefner's mansion, people show up, celebrities, and Stephen Baldwin, Billy Baldwin, Daniel Baldwin show up, and each Baldwin we'll order them as looking less and less like Alec. So initially, the guards are pretty good with Alec, and so they see, I don't know, Daniel show up, like, no, you can't come in. But as they get less Alec Baldwin-y, the guards err, and they can't really tell whether this is a Baldwin of concern or not. And then Omicron, in my view, Omicron is Haley Baldwin. That's Justin Bieber's wife, and she's apparently Alec Baldwin's niece. Now she is, probably genetically some Baldwin, but she's harmless. She's benign. She doesn't punch photographers, et cetera, et cetera. So you would want her in your party. She might be a net benefit at your party. And there's no reason to think that the guards, your immune system is prepared for Alec. Is he going to be able to differentiate from her? Nor should they. Anyway, so the question here, to circle back a little bit, is if this mRNA, the whole reason, the raison d'etre of this mRNA technology is you can switch it out pretty easily. Why didn't they? Why didn't they switch it out for the alpha, the beta, the delta, and so forth? Because when they were giving monoclonal antibody injections, if you were sick enough or wealthy enough or in a wealthy enough country, you would get a VOC monoclonal antibody. You would not get ancestral when you showed up with beta.
So I think this is not my field of expertise, but I have based on my observations. Here's the story I've come up with to answer your question. So I think that it's not software. That in fact this is a very complicated problem. It's that when you add an antigen to the mRNA kind of platform, it interacts in ways that are hard to predict. And so you don't, and so you do safety testing on animals, and it doesn't work the way you expected. It's a much more complicated problem than simply just taking the antigen sequence, mRNA sequence that codes for the antigen, replacing it, and then it's like changing out just the software on your computer. No, in fact, the sequence then somehow interacts with the other parts of the vaccine in complicated ways that are difficult to predict. It's just another vaccine technology. You still have to do all of the work. So you're not cutting down on the work that you have to do, although that you've made that promise that you could like just update it like that. And I think that's what happened. It's why it's more difficult, like technically more difficult than maybe that people hoped when they first rolled this technology out, to just do an update. And if you're going to be sort of reasonable and rational and responsible as a regulatory agency, you ask the drug companies that are rolling this technology updates out to do another randomized trial right? You have a population. So, I mean, so like lots of things are different than in 2020, right? So for instance, you mentioned Omicron as potentially, what do you call her? Haley Baldwin? I don't know.
It's the Haley Baldwin to SARS-CoV-2 ancestral Alec
Right.
Baldwin.
So I guess the analogy is
only
that
a little Baldwin-y. It's not very much. It's certainly not dangerous.
okay, so I think that's the question, right? So that's a question to which I don't have an answer. What if Omicron had been the strain that had been released in 2020 to an immune naive population? Would it have been harmless? I don't know the answer to that question. So one story is that only reason Omicron's harmless is because we no longer have an immune naive population. A very large fraction of the population has immune protection.
So I'm going to push back on that. Only
I don't know for certain. I'm just giving you a story, right? I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. I wrote an article in the Daily Skeptic last year. It should be in real medical journals, frankly, but such is life. It's basically should Omicron not be called COVID-19? It may very well just be another one of our many prior coronaviruses. If you look at textbooks in the before times, before SARS 1, 2003, in 1999, there's a textbook on common colds and so forth, and coronaviruses are the second most common named cause of common cold. So they represent 12 to 20% of common colds. You got your adenovirus, rhinovirus, some influenza B, and unknown and so forth. If we were, in before times and we weren't, testing for COVID, we wouldn't make anything about Omicron. It's just another coronavirus. And, anyway, I there is some crossover in the testing. And I think a lot of the testing, frankly, is not discriminate enough for the SARS-CoV-2 and VOCs. And it's showing some overlap with Omicron and probably with other coronavirus common colds, such as were around prior. So I think that some of the data has always been confounded and conflated with common cold coronavirus.
I mean, that's certainly possible. I said, I was reading something about the OC43 coronavirus that's in common human circulation now and causes a common cold, right? Yeah. And apparently there are scientists that link it to this massive worldwide pandemic that happened starting in Russia in the late 1900s.
I've read that.
Huge numbers of people died from it. It circulated around the world, causing like all kinds of harm, right? And now they think that's OC43, which now is the cause of the common cold. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that we were all exposed to OC43 when we were kids, babies. Mm-hmm. Our bodies didn't overreact to it because we basically know how to deal with new things when we're a baby. Our immune systems know how to deal with new things. Kind of like when we're a kid, we know how to learn new languages much easier than when we're older. Our immune system is pluripotent in some sense. Mm-hmm. And then when we got exposed to it later in life, because of that immunity, it's no longer deadly to us or as deadly to us, right? And so the repeated exposure doesn't actually harm us, but in fact, quite the opposite. It turns something that would normally be deadly if we were to be exposed to it as an adult in an immune naive state, turns it into something that's much less deadly. It's possible that Omicron is like that. That now again, I don't know for certain. I haven't seen studies that definitively show one way or the other, and I know good scientists who I trust and respect who have opposite opinions on this. Mm-hmm. So I don't know for certain what the answer is here, but I will say this: vaccinating in a population just on the basis of a trial that says I'm producing antibodies, when you no longer have an immune naive population, it makes no sense. And to use the analogy of the flu shot, where you use the flu shot's ability to produce antibodies as a basis for the updated flu shot every season. There you have decades of experience with that procedure, and you're not using a novel vaccine technology, right? You're using a traditional vaccine technology with a pretty good safety profile. That's a very different thing than the COVID vaccine with this novel technology. You don't really understand very well how it's interacting with the immunity that you previously had. It was incumbent on our regulatory agencies to require these companies to run real randomized studies for these boosters before they recommended it at scale.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And moreover, the bivalent, I'm part of the, I make a few proposals in my article, but one of them is that the E part of the EUA had long disappeared. There's no emergency for the EUA to cover the bivalent one that got trotted out a year ago. No sense at all. And the only reason for it to be there is I think malfeasant, nefarious, regulatory capture, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I think there's a money trail, and cui bono. It's not necessarily the people. You're talking about pro bono, but cui bono is the other one, and who benefits? I think a lot of this has been oddly enough, shockingly enough, the elites. I think you bring this up. I listened to your interview with Gerard Baker of the Wall Street Journal some time ago, and you talk about I think you maybe call it the laptop class, and there's 20% of the population that's just doing hunky-dory. Their kids did hunky-dory. They're computer literate, and so where the computers are, maybe they'd even do better outside of school because they can be more focused and all that kind of stuff instead of focused protection, focused education. But what I call new Americans, they don't necessarily have that capability or ability to convey that. They don't have the institutional knowledge of having had their parents go through, top flight college and be literate and have dining table talk, regarding Wall Street Journal editorials or whatever. It just doesn't happen. And so this has caused a bigger gap, and all the people who worry about the income gap and the equality gap, equity, blah blah blah. On the one hand, they're moaning about that or debating about or whatever, advocating for that. On the other hand, they're doing everything they can to subvert it.
I mean, this was a war on the working class. These lockdowns, the school closures, it was a war on the poor. It was a war on children, right? That's the way I think about it. It was essentially a trickle-down epidemiology policy. The theory is that these lockdowns will what do actually lockdowns actually mean for the very different things for the poor and the vulnerable and working class people than it is for the relatively well off. For the relatively well off, it's you can stay at home and stay safe. You can get other people to take the risk of being exposed to the disease that you don't want to take. Other people cook the food, grow the food, deliver it to you. If your the electrical lines go down, if you need plumbing, you need that you have people to deliver to you. You don't lose your job because you can replace it with Zoom. And for the working class, it's exactly the opposite. Like you are asked to go out and take the risks that other people won't take. Your kids don't get educated because you can't be at home to sit there and babysit Zoom on them, right? And for the poorest people in the world, outside of the developed world, it means essentially poverty, as we talked about earlier, right? And so the theory of the lockdowns is we just need to do this to make the lives destroy the lives of the poor, the working class people, and that will protect the rich. That's trickle-down epidemiology. That's the very definition of a policy that was, just an immoral policy that decided that really it was only a certain class of people that were worthy of protection. It was focused protection of the laptop class.
Well, the only thing I don't like about it is I do think that trickle-down economics has kind of a bad rap. I actually believe.
Oh, Randy, I think trickle-down epidemiology should get a bad rap too.
Well,
maybe in a different way. That's what you mean.
But I think your version of trickle-down epidemiology is generally, a malfeasant policy. I think trickle-down economics potentially has better repercussions because wealth does flow, and if people are doing well at the top, generally, other people will get better. That's the whole rationale we have for the poor world, the poor world wanting to engage in trade and so forth. So because it will trickle down. I haven't set foot in Ghana, but Ghana's a better place, in 2018 than it was in 1978. Things do get better, and it is because things somewhat trickle down. Certain places get wealthy, other places will get wealthier.
Well, that's a complicated question, right? So, like, I don't want to get too deep into the debate over that, but I think one thing we can agree on is that there have been tremendous progress over the last 30 or 40 years in the well-being of the poorest of the world. I think it's something on the order of 1 billion people were lifted out of poverty over the last 40 years, in part as a consequence of the globalization of the economy. I mean, it could be trade, it could be, I wouldn't call that trickle-down epidemiology per se. Like they're direct investments also in the well-being of the poor that were also made. So I don't think that, I think the fact that that so many people's lives have been improved, have been lifted out of dire poverty around the world, that's just a fact about the way that the world was. The lockdowns were a severe departure from that.
Mm-hmm.
That's what led the World Bank to project that 100 million people would be thrown into dire poverty. Was that the cessation of those of the sort of the globalization patterns, which led poor countries to reorganize their economy so that they fit into the global economy, that the supply chain disruptions would feel the pointy end of that would be the poor people, the poorest people of the world, who would lose their jobs as a consequence of the supply chain disruptions, and that they would be thrown into poverty so dire that they would even consider selling their kids into sexual slavery or put them in child labor. That happened in the poorest parts of the world. At scale, it happened.
And it will continue to. It will continue.
Yeah, and so I mean so that's why I think that lockdowns are such an immoral policy. It's not as if this was not predictable.
Yeah. I don't know if you've heard this Konstantin Kisin. I think he's
I was on the podcast. Trigonometry, he calls it. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good. That's what that is, because he has it in two pieces. I saw the trigger part, and then I saw the other. I couldn't understand, but if you say it all at once, it makes sense. Trigonometry. But he has I guess it's gotten 500 million views, where he's at, I think, the Oxford Union Debate Society in the UK. And he brings up this point, and he's talking about green, not kind of the global climate, whatever, that emergency instead of COVID. But they're reasonably similar in the sense that he brings up the point that you bring up, that people, if they can have a job based on a working engine for their farm or something like that, as opposed to the donkey, they're gonna buy that. And if the choice is their kid's starving, or you're having some different level of CO2, they're going to make sure the kid doesn't starve. And he makes an additional point that the UK, like, suddenly submerged in the North Sea, or wherever, it wouldn't make a bit of difference, because the gross changes in consumption are happening in the poorer parts of the world, China, Latin America, so forth. Anyway, and probably India and subcontinent there, but it's the same kind of point. That I had George Gilder on my show about a month ago, and he's a futurist economist and brilliant. And his basic, I guess I'm not going to be able to tie it all as neatly as possible, but we get out of poverty through knowledge and commerce, and when we stifle that, we will go backwards. And this has been our big, break from the past, is not natural resources, it's mental resources. And I feel as if a lot of these have been wasted. So I don't want, maybe think about the last lap of this talk here. But insofar as there is a laptop class, and you probably live in the midst of it and have for a while, I think you're Stanford, and Stanford, as well as Stanford professorship. You've had a window on that institution, probably a number of decades, 30, 40 years, I don't know.
37 years, yeah.
Thank you. And Stanford has I'm a Yaley, and I'm very disappointed in the way Yale has acquitted itself on different levels. Is there friction there? What do you think is going on with some of the Stanford intellect and intellectuals, and the intelligentsia, whatever you want to call it? And where do they go? I mean, is it just a matter of where their bread is buttered in terms of funding, as you mentioned, like NIAID or NIH funding? So are professors genuinely interested in open debate? Or are they following the money?
Oh gosh, Randy, this is a depressing subject for me, because if you'd asked me 3.5 years ago, I would have told you that Stanford is an absolutely wonderful place for doing research, even on controversial topics. And that I personally, in my 34 years back then, had really grown to respect and love Stanford because of its commitment to its motto, which is "Let the winds of freedom blow." Academic freedom.
Yeah.
And I personally had worked on topics that were quite controversial. On if you work in health policy, you're going to work on controversial topics unless you want to be get nothing done. And sometimes with implications that sometimes the left would like, and sometimes the implications the right would like. I'm doing research. I can't predict what my results are going to be, or who's going to like them or not. Right? That's not my job, anyways. Right? It's just to do my research and say what I believe, if I'm finding as honestly as I can. And Stanford was a great place for that kind of for an environment. I've never felt like I've been ostracized as well as a result of it. During the pandemic, Stanford leadership utterly failed to keep that atmosphere in place, and in fact, actively worked to undermine it. Right. So, and I think the treatment that Scott Atlas received during the pandemic, when he was the President Trump's advisor by Stanford faculty, but also by the Stanford administration, that essentially tried to say, they passed a resolution in the faculty senate effectively excommunicating him. Not formally excommunicating him, but essentially saying that he was not working outside of the norms of Stanford's professionalism. That was a real tear in Stanford's mission. Stanford's mission is to allow there to be honest discussion and disagreement, if there is, on key topics in policy and in science and whatnot. They were saying that Scott was acting outside the bounds for upholding a scientific viewpoint that they disagreed with, and that therefore he should be excommunicated, or a condemnation letter.
Moreover, he was right. On top of the fact that he was right and they were wrong.
Well, he was definitely right, but that's a different question, right?
I know it is, but I'm just putting it out there. It's not like he said, it's not like he said, trees are purple and they jump up and down when you're asleep.
No, he said, focus, do better protection of older people. Don't close schools. The masks aren't working particularly well. I mean, he was saying things that in retrospect, everyone should have recognized was right. But even at the time, they should have recognized it right. But you can grant that there was a disagreement between the people that signed the petition to get him condemned and who voted in the faculty senate to condemn him, versus the people who versus what his point of view was and my point of view was at the time, or Johnny Needy's point of view was at the time, or Mike Levitt's point of view at the time, right? All of those prominent Stanford people are saying that there's some colorable argument in favor of what Scott's saying, right? But so the existence of the debate would have been fine. What if Stanford had then impaneled a discussion between prominent people who disagreed on COVID policy in July of 2020? That would be the right way for a prominent academic institution to manage this disagreement. Instead, they condemned Scott. They effectively excommunicated him. With the faculty senate fully behind it, with the president of the university voting in favor of that kind of excommunication. It was an utter failure of Stanford at a critical time to uphold its mission, and as a result, I think it's not surprising to me that Stanford has lost so much of its luster over the last 3 or 4 years, right? Most prominently with the president resigning over some other scientific scandal. But a lot of the Stanford's specialness comes from its commitment to academic freedom, to letting people discuss even controversial ideas freely. In places where we can respect each other. Instead, we had what is effectively a Stanford Civil War, where I was on the tail end of it, the bad end of it. Once person in your midst who's like a close colleague of yours is excommunicated, it's very difficult, if you want to speak up in favor of the ideas that led to his excommunication, to continue to do so. You decide to do that at great cost. I mean, for 2 years, I had death threats and I had hate mail every time I appeared in public. And on Stanford campus, there was a poster campaign in 2021 all over campus accusing me of killing people in Florida. And this despite the fact that all-cause excess deaths in Florida at the time from COVID were lower than they were in California, and are still cumulative all-cause excess deaths are still lower in Florida than they were in California.
With an older population to boot.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could do age adjustment, but the point is that there was no colorable evidence that Florida did any worse. based on its policies compared to California. And yet I was scared to walk on campus for a few days because of this poster campaign. Stanford allowed a hostile work environment for people that opposed these lockdowns, and still haven't come to terms with that fact.
Horrible. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for you. I mean, I'm sorry for a lot of things. I'm sorry that
well, I mean, I don't know. It's just one of these things where, like, it's more like falling out of love, right? I mean, I love this place. At one point, at 2021, I seriously considered leaving this place. I almost got rid of a whole bunch of my 35 years of paraphernalia at the time, but I didn't. I kept it. I keep hoping that well, maybe with the new president, things will get better. We'll see. I mean, I think
you should stick it out, because I think you need to be there. And, it is an open question, like what happens to the institutions, whether we just have to make new ones, so forth. I had also on my show Scott Johnston, who wrote a book called Campus Land. And it's lighthearted satire. It's basically kind of like Tom Wolfe, cross between Bonfire of the Vanities and I Am Charlotte Simmons. Two of his, well, first is one of his great works, and the other's not as great. But it's a campus view. It's really deep satire. It's hilarious, and I think you'll see resonance with Stanford, and you'll spend great 3 hours, whatever the number is, 2 hours, however long it takes you to read it.
I'll look it up. Yeah, sounds good.
Oh, it's a great book, and it's a weird thing, that we're in the midst of, kind of these. I was not a history guy. I was chemistry and physics major. And a lot of the history, I thought, we kind of all moved beyond it. I mean, I know there's that book, The End of History, whatever, Fukuyama, so forth. And I didn't really have a horse in that race. But, I think on the other hand, we have some deep societal pathologies, and we're working in this almost like Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass narrative, where off with their heads, you can't say certain things. And I've had a little bit more history injected. My wife is a classicist, and so the parties we go to are with classics professors and so forth. I've had to, kind of earn my chops in order to be a discourse. But the default position of humanity is not democracy. It's not meritocracy. It's not free speech, and so forth. And at our peril, we're going to re-enter some of the darker ages.
We may already be there. I mean, Martin Kulldorff declared the end of the Age of Enlightenment during the pandemic. Right. You have a scientific high clerisy deciding what's fringe and what's not. And then enforcing that at the point of essentially excommunication of people that they disagree with them. You have a society that violates its fundamental commitments to basic civil rights like free speech. And happily so because it's supposedly dangerous to allow people to disagree with public health authorities. Unless we consciously decide that we don't want that as a society, that is now the norm.
Okay, so I'm gonna end. Maybe we'll see if we end. But I'd like maybe if you could touch on the Twitter files, your role in it, Missouri versus Biden. What are the ramifications? What are the repercussions? What's the blowback? And save for the fact that Elon Musk's torturous purchase of this thing, which he almost didn't do, would we know anything about it? And how have we benefited, or did we?
Okay, I got to run after this, but last topic. So I think the key thing to know, this is based on a lawsuit that I filed again with that the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's office has filed against the Biden administration. I'm a plaintiff in this lawsuit, represented by the New Civil Liberties Alliance. This lawsuit has uncovered a vast effort by the federal bureaucracy to control what speech happens on social media, on COVID, on elections, on Russian disinformation, whatever topic, a huge bunch of topics. The federal government acted by telling social media companies who to censor and what to censor, backed up essentially by threats, by saying, look, if you don't abide by this, if you don't censor these people and these ideas, you're killing people. And we regulate, with reminders essentially that the governments regulate these social media companies. Okay, so that's the reality that the government, and there's to document this, we deposed a dozen people within the federal bureaucracy, including Tony Fauci, including high members of the Biden White House. We have emails directly of this communicating, telling social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, so on, what to censor and who to censor. And so these social media companies, I think through the pandemic, were acting basically in response to those threats or perceptions about those threats. But the way they acted was terrible. Like, they essentially put the thumb on the scale in the debate. If you were to, for instance, to say that the vaccine doesn't stop transmission sometime in 2021, you would get labeled as misinformation, even though it was a true fact. By the way, in these discovery documents, it turns out that the government didn't care whether the facts were true or false. They just cared whether there were critics online effectively criticizing their policies, their positions, their science. Truth didn't matter at all in this. No. And so the social media companies, up until Elon Musk bought Twitter, complied. They complied with this, and I think it was tremendously harmful that they did, because had we had an honest debate, an open debate, many of the policies might not have been adopted, or at least certainly rescinded earlier or tempered in time. When Elon Musk bought Twitter, turns out that that I had been put on a Twitter blacklist, so that my tweets wouldn't, would see a relatively limited audience. But I didn't even know. The day I joined Twitter, I was put on this blacklist. I mean, what did I say other than that the Great Barrington Declaration was a good idea that day? I think that happened because Twitter was told by the governments to look out for people like me or people like me. Just, as a society, I mean, I saw a poll. I think 70% of Democrats are in favor of this kind of control of speech, in favor, because they're afraid that the misinformation is so dangerous. You shouldn't let people speak freely. 40% of Republicans were in favor of it. We're at a very dangerous point in our society, Randy, and it's not clear to me which direction we'll go. And I think we have to choose. Do we want our old liberal, small L liberal democracy and the age of enlightenment to continue, or do we want a biomedical security state that clamps down on supposed misinformation, that promises, in exchange for biosurveillance and restrictions, protection against emerging pandemics, and with vast infrastructure set up to go dig these viruses out and check, with vaccines developed rapidly and at scale, and enforced, essentially with threat to your job and livelihood if you don't comply. That's the choice we have to face, because you can't really have both.
I appreciate that. Well, thank you so much for your time. Before we end, I'd like to show my audience how they can support this podcast. I have a book called Overturning Zika, which I might rename the Sharknado of Misinformation. It's a lot of the same characters. Dr. Fauci, WHO, and so forth, were involved in creating a pandemic in Brazil 2015-16, or not creating it, but aggrandizing it. It's got it for the same price. Got a picture of me on the cover there. I'd like you to buy it and look at it, because in a sense, it's kind of the Fabergé egg of pandemics. It's an entire whole thing. We have a little bit more time and perspective. It's not local. It's Brazil mostly, and we have an ability to look at it and see and evaluate the type of judgments that happen. This is a repetitive process. And so, a lot of the same people, top epidemiologists and so forth, inveigh and intone on this topic. And from our distance and perspective, we can see that there's not necessarily, as Gertrude Stein said about Oakland, unfortunately, there's no there. So you're closer to Oakland. I'm sure there is there more to a greater extent than there was with Zika's causing microcephaly. Don't get me wrong, Zika is a real smaller version of a dengue virus, not a human virus, not a human accessible or danger virus. It's a real virus. It's the fifth, here my prop, it's the fifth dengue. And microcephaly is a real phenomenon based on size. So wherever you want to call it, 2 sigma, 3 sigma, 4 sigma, whatever. It's a real problem. It just so happens that one does not cause the other. That's kind of the short version of my book. A lot of bad science, hilarity ensues. Anyway, Thank all of you for coming and listening, and thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. I'm certainly your debt, and if there's anything I can do in future to help you, please let me know.
Well, Randy, I think that the work you're doing with Zika is really important. I read your article. I'm actually in the middle of reading your book, so I wish you all the best with it. I mean, I think I think we have to have voices in public health that are expressing skepticism, and I'm really glad, especially reasoned skepticism the way you do. I think it's just, you see during the pandemic how vitally important it is. I want to live in a liberal democracy. Thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.